Investigators say an Amber Alert saved a little boy from mortal danger. Federal prosecutors today charged 35-year-old Jennifer Stately with murdering the child's two brothers in Red Lake. Investigators say that she stabbed her 5- and 6-year-old sons and set their home on fire in March. Stately then drove off with her 3-year-old. That Amber Alert helped officers quickly catch her. Investigators say that this tragedy is proof that alerts save lives.
The fire was already swallowing the house by the time the first sirens cut through the cold northern Minnesota night. Flames climbed into the dark sky. Smoke rolled across the snow-covered ground. Neighbors stood frozen in shock, some clutching their coats, others holding their phones, whispering the same question over and over. Where are the children? Inside that burning home was a mother. And inside that home were her children. By the time firefighters forced their way through the smoke and heat, the scene they encountered would unravel into one of the most disturbing federal murder cases in recent Minnesota history. Her name was Jennifer Stately. She was 37 years old, a mother, a woman who, just days before, had been living what appeared to be an ordinary life in northern Minnesota. But prosecutors would later argue that what happened inside that house was not sudden chaos. They said it was deliberate. They said it was premeditated. And they said it ended with a child stabbed and another left inside a house that had been intentionally set on fire. When the smoke cleared, the tragedy was no longer just a local emergency. It became a federal case, one that would bring in the U.S. Attorney's Office, federal investigators, forensic experts, and eventually, a jury who would have to decide one haunting question. Was Jennifer Stately legally insane? Or did she know exactly what she was doing? The charges that followed were severe. 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, 2 counts of murder in the course of committing child abuse, 1 count of murder in the course of committing arson, and 1 count of arson. 6 federal counts, each one carrying the weight of unimaginable loss. But behind the legal language, behind the courtroom arguments and psychiatric evaluations, lies a deeper story. A story about what investigators found inside that home, about what the prosecution believed happened before the flames ever ignited, about the defense's claim that Jennifer Stately was suffering from a severe mental disease that stripped her of reality itself. In federal court, insanity is not a vague idea. It has a precise legal meaning. It requires proof that a defendant could not understand the nature or wrongfulness of their actions. Her defense team argued she met that threshold. The jury did not agree. After deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts. The decision meant something critical. 12 jurors believed that, at the time of the killings and the fire, Jennifer Stately understood what she was doing. That conclusion would seal her fate. But how did a mother's home become a crime scene engulfed in flames? What happened in the hours leading up to that fire? What evidence convinced federal prosecutors this was premeditated? And what did mental health experts say on the stand that ultimately failed to persuade the jury? Tonight we go inside the timeline, the investigation, the courtroom battle over sanity and responsibility. Because in this case, the fire was only the beginning. By the time investigators stepped into what remained of the home in northern Minnesota, the flames had been extinguished, but the smell of smoke still clung to everything. The structure was blackened. The windows were shattered. Snow around the property had melted into dirty gray slush from the intense heat. What first responders initially treated as a house fire quickly transformed into something else entirely. Something intentional. Authorities would later confirm that inside that home, one child had suffered fatal stab wounds before the fire ever started. Another child had been inside when the fire was set. That detail changed everything. Fire investigators began combing through the debris almost immediately. Federal jurisdiction applied in this case because of where the crime occurred and the legal status involved, bringing in federal agents alongside local law enforcement. Soon, agents connected to the U.S. Attorney's Office were reviewing early findings. The first major question was simple. Was this a tragic accident, or was the fire set deliberately to destroy evidence? Investigators found signs that pointed to arson. The burn patterns were not random. Certain areas showed concentrated ignition points. Experts trained in fire dynamics determined that the blaze did not begin from faulty wiring or a kitchen accident. It had been started intentionally. That discovery shifted the case from tragic to criminal. Inside the remains of the home, investigators documented every inch of damage. Forensic teams worked methodically, preserving what little physical evidence the fire had not consumed. Among the debris, they located a knife believed to be connected to the stabbing. Even in the aftermath of flames, certain materials endure. Metal survives, patterns survive, and sometimes so does evidence. As the investigation unfolded, attention turned to Jennifer Stately herself. At 37 years old, she was not unknown in her community. Neighbors described her as quiet. Some said she appeared overwhelmed in recent months. Others recalled nothing unusual at all. That contrast, ordinary on the outside, catastrophic behind closed doors, is often what makes cases like this so chilling. Authorities began reconstructing the timeline. What happened in the hours before the fire? Who had seen her that day? What communications had been sent? Phone records, digital data, and witness statements became central pieces of the puzzle. Investigators reviewed call logs, text messages, and social media activity. They needed to understand her state of mind leading up to the crime. According to prosecutors, the evidence painted a picture of deliberation. They argued that one child was attacked first. Then, at some point after, the fire was started with another child still inside the house. That sequence mattered. Because in federal court, premeditation requires proof that the act was planned or considered, even briefly, before it was carried out. This was not described as a sudden explosion of rage. Prosecutors alleged it was intentional and purposeful. When Jennifer Stately was taken into custody, her behavior became another point of scrutiny. Investigators documented her demeanor. Was she coherent, disoriented, detached? Every word she spoke and every word she didn't would later be analyzed in court. As news spread, the community struggled to process what had happened. A house fire is devastating, but a house fire tied to allegations of a mother killing her own children and setting the home ablaze, that shook northern Minnesota deeply. The case moved quickly into federal court. Because of the jurisdictional factors, the charges were brought under federal law, and they were severe. 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. 2 counts of murder committed during child abuse. 1 count of murder committed during arson. And 1 count of arson. 6 counts total. Each count carried the possibility of life in federal prison. But almost immediately, Jennifer Stately's defense team signaled the direction they would take. They would pursue an insanity defense. In federal court, that is a high bar. The defense must prove that, at the time of the crime, the defendant suffered from a severe mental disease or defect that rendered them unable to understand the nature and wrongfulness of their actions. It is not enough to show depression, not enough to show stress, not enough to show emotional instability. The standard is strict, and juries are often skeptical. As pretrial proceedings unfolded, mental health evaluations became central to the case. Court-appointed experts assessed Jennifer Stately. Defense-retained psychologists conducted their own examinations. prosecutors prepared to challenge those conclusions. Behind the scenes, the legal battle was taking shape long before the jury would ever hear opening statements. Prosecutors were building a case centered on evidence, physical evidence from the scene, forensic analysis of the fire, and a timeline that suggested deliberate action. The defense was building a case centered on Jennifer Stately's mental state. What was happening inside her mind in the days and hours before the fire? Was she experiencing a severe psychiatric episode? Did she understand what she was doing? Or was she operating under a break from reality, so profound that criminal responsibility should not apply? As the months passed, the case drew increasing attention. Federal murder trials are not common in smaller communities, and this one involved deeply emotional elements: children, fire, and the claim of insanity. When the trial began, the courtroom atmosphere was tense. Federal prosecutors laid out their narrative carefully. They walked jurors through the evidence collected at the scene. They described how investigators determined the fire was intentionally set. They explained the forensic findings that indicated one child's fatal injuries occurred before the flames began. The sequence was critical, because if the stabbing occurred first and the fire came afterward, that suggested not chaos but escalation. And escalation suggests thought. The prosecution argued that Jennifer Stately knew what she was doing, that she understood the consequences, that setting the fire was an additional act, not a confused reflex. They emphasized the premeditation charge. Even a short period of reflection, even minutes, can satisfy that legal requirement. The defense, however, painted a very different picture. They argued that Jennifer Stately was suffering from a severe mental illness at the time of the offense, that her perception of reality was distorted, that she was not acting with criminal intent, but under the grip of psychological breakdown. They introduced expert testimony. Psychiatrists explained diagnoses. They described symptoms that can impair judgment, distort thinking, and disconnect a person from reality. Jurors listened, because ultimately, their task would not be to decide whether the events happened. It was largely undisputed that the children died and that the fire was set. Their task was to decide whether Jennifer Stately was legally responsible. That distinction is subtle but powerful. Throughout testimony, the courtroom remained quiet. Evidence photographs were shown. Forensic specialists explained burn patterns and ignition analysis. Medical experts described findings related to the cause of death. The defense cross-examined each witness, probing for uncertainty. Could stress have triggered mental collapse? Could her actions have been influenced by severe psychiatric symptoms? Prosecutors pushed back. They argued that certain behaviors demonstrated awareness, that steps taken before and after the crimes showed understanding, and that awareness meant legal sanity. By the end of the first phase of the trial, the lines were clearly drawn. On one side, deliberate, premeditated murder followed by arson. On the other, a mother whose mind, according to her defense, had fractured under severe mental illness. The jury would eventually deliberate. But before that moment arrived, they would hear more testimony, more expert opinions, more arguments about intent, sanity, and responsibility. Because in federal court, especially in a case involving children and fire, every detail matters. Every minute matters. Every decision matters. The question now shifted from what happened to why. As the federal trial moved deeper into testimony in Minnesota, the courtroom focus narrowed almost entirely to Jennifer Stately's mind. The physical evidence had already established a grim sequence: one child fatally stabbed, another inside when the house was intentionally set on fire. Fire experts testified that the blaze was not accidental. Medical experts explained that at least one of the fatal injuries occurred before the fire ignited. Prosecutors had laid their foundation. Now the defense began building theirs. They did not dispute that Jennifer Stately caused the deaths. That was not their strategy. Their strategy was far more complex. They argued she was legally insane at the time of the crimes. In federal court, that standard is strict. The jury was instructed that mental illness alone is not enough. Stress is not enough. Depression is not enough. Even severe emotional distress is not enough. The law requires proof that, due to a severe mental disease or defect, the defendant could not understand the nature and wrongfulness of her actions. That word, wrongfulness, became central. The defense called mental health professionals to the stand. Psychiatrists and psychologists who had evaluated Jennifer Stately over multiple sessions testified about her mental state. They described symptoms consistent with severe psychiatric disturbance. They spoke about distorted thinking patterns, about paranoia, about emotional collapse. They told the jury that, in their professional opinion, she was experiencing a profound break from reality at the time of the offense. One expert explained how certain psychiatric episodes can alter perception so dramatically that the individual no longer processes consequences normally. Another described how delusional beliefs can feel absolutely real to the person experiencing them. The defense painted a picture of a woman who was not thinking clearly, a woman overwhelmed, a woman whose internal world, they suggested, had fractured. But prosecutors were prepared. On cross-examination, they pressed the experts with precision. Did she know she was holding a knife? Yes. Did she understand that stabbing someone causes serious harm? Yes. Did she take actions after the stabbing? Yes. Did she start a fire? Yes. Each yes mattered. Because the prosecution's argument was simple. Even if the case was not, mental illness does not automatically eliminate responsibility. The jury had to determine whether she understood what she was doing and whether she understood it was wrong. Prosecutors introduced evidence they said demonstrated awareness. They pointed to behavior that suggested planning. They referenced the sequence of events, stabbing first, fire second, as evidence of decision-making, not confusion. They argued that starting a fire after the stabbing indicated consciousness of wrongdoing, that it showed an attempt to escalate or conceal. They did not have to prove motive. They had to prove intent. And intent can exist even in a disturbed mind. The jury also heard about Jennifer Stately's behavior when first responders arrived. Witnesses described her demeanor. Some testified that she was not incoherent, not disconnected, not visibly out of touch with reality in the way one might expect from someone completely unaware of their actions. Defense attorneys countered that mental illness does not always look dramatic, that someone can appear calm externally while experiencing internal chaos, that psychiatric crises do not always resemble scenes from television. The courtroom atmosphere was tense during these exchanges. Jurors took notes constantly. No one shifted casually in their seats. Every detail felt consequential. Outside the courtroom, the community continued to grapple with shock. Northern Minnesota is not unfamiliar with hardship, but cases like this pierce deeply. The involvement of children, the use of fire, the federal charges, it was overwhelming. Inside the courtroom, however, emotion had to be balanced with law. At one point, a prosecution expert testified about the evaluation process used in federal insanity assessments. The expert explained that evaluators consider whether the defendant understood the physical nature of their actions and whether they understood those actions were morally and legally wrong. The prosecution emphasized that Jennifer Stately engaged in behavior that suggested awareness. They highlighted the sequence again. First the stabbing, then the fire. They argued that this was not random movement. It was escalation. It required steps. It required intention. The defense, in response, argued that a person in the midst of a severe mental break can still perform actions. They can move, they can speak, they can act, but their perception of reality may be altered. One defense expert testified that severe psychiatric conditions can distort reasoning so profoundly that the individual believes they are acting under necessity, fear, or delusion. The jury's task was not to diagnose her. Their task was to determine legal responsibility. During closing arguments, prosecutors were direct. They reminded jurors that the insanity defense is rare for a reason, that it requires clear proof of incapacity, that difficult circumstances and mental health struggles do not automatically erase accountability. They argued that the evidence showed Jennifer Stately knew what she was doing. They argued that she knew it was wrong. The defense, in contrast, urged jurors to look beyond the surface. They asked them to consider the medical testimony, to weigh expert opinions, to recognize that severe mental illness can overpower rational thought. They reminded jurors that the burden for insanity lies with the defense, but that if reasonable doubt existed regarding her mental capacity, the verdict should reflect that. When closing arguments ended, the courtroom felt heavy. The jury was instructed carefully by the federal judge. The legal definitions of premeditation, murder in the course of child abuse, murder during arson, and arson itself were read aloud. The standard for insanity was explained again in precise terms. Then the jury retired to deliberate. No one knows exactly what is said inside a jury room, but in cases like this, the discussions are often intense. Jurors must reconcile emotional reaction with legal standards, sympathy with evidence, complexity with clarity. Hours passed. Then more. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the silence was nearly absolute. One by one, the verdicts were read. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. Guilty on 2 counts of murder committed during child abuse. Guilty on 1 count of murder committed during arson. Guilty on 1 count of arson. 6 counts. All guilty. The insanity defense had been rejected. The jury's decision meant they believed Jennifer Stately understood the nature of her actions, that she understood they were wrong, that she was legally responsible. For federal first-degree murder convictions, the consequences are severe. Mandatory life imprisonment is typical. There is no parole in the federal system. The verdict did not erase the tragedy. It did not answer every psychological question, but it resolved the legal one. Jennifer Stately was accountable. As the courtroom emptied, the emotional weight remained. This was not a case about strangers. It was a case about a mother and her children, about a home turned into a crime scene, about fire used not by accident but by intention. When the jury foreperson finished reading the 6th guilty verdict, the courtroom in federal court in Minnesota fell into a silence that felt heavier than any argument delivered during the trial. There were no dramatic outbursts, no shouting, just the quiet finality of a decision that could never be undone. Jennifer Stately had been convicted on all counts: 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, 2 counts of murder committed in the course of child abuse, 1 count of murder committed during arson, and 1 count of arson. The insanity defense had failed. For weeks, jurors had listened to forensic experts, psychiatrists, investigators, and attorneys dissect what happened inside that house. They had examined photographs, timelines, medical conclusions, and fire analysis reports. They had been instructed carefully on federal law, especially the strict definition of legal insanity. And in the end, they concluded that Jennifer Stately understood the nature and wrongfulness of her actions. That determination carried enormous consequences. In the federal system, first-degree murder convictions typically result in life imprisonment. There is no federal parole. A life sentence means exactly that. The judge would later move toward formal sentencing, but the outcome was already clear. Jennifer Stately would spend the rest of her life in federal custody. The legal battle was over, but the questions surrounding the case did not simply disappear. The sentencing phase in federal court is procedural, but it is also deeply symbolic. The judge considers statutory requirements, sentencing guidelines, victim impact statements, and arguments from both sides, while life imprisonment is mandated for certain federal murder convictions. The court still acknowledges the weight of the decision. Victim impact statements are often the most emotionally difficult part of any sentencing. In cases involving children, those statements reverberate beyond the courtroom walls. They speak not just to the loss of life, but to futures erased, birthdays that will never happen, graduations that will never be celebrated, milestones that will never be reached. Even in a courtroom governed by statutes and legal definitions, humanity surfaces during those moments. As the sentence was imposed, it closed one chapter, but it also underscored a broader issue that extends beyond this single case. The intersection between mental illness and criminal responsibility remains one of the most complex areas of the justice system. Jennifer Stately's defense argued she suffered from a severe mental disease at the time of the offense. They presented expert testimony. They described symptoms. They offered medical evaluations. But federal law sets a very high threshold. To be found not guilty by reason of insanity in federal court, the defense must prove that, at the time of the offense, the defendant was unable to appreciate the nature and quality or the wrongfulness of their acts due to a severe mental disease or defect. That standard does not ask whether someone was struggling. It asks whether they understood what they were doing and whether they understood it was wrong. The jury decided she did. That decision reflects how rarely insanity defenses succeed in federal court. Historically, such defenses are used infrequently, and success rates are low. Jurors often require overwhelming evidence of complete disconnection from reality before they will absolve criminal responsibility. This case also highlights the legal difference between mental illness and legal insanity. A person can be diagnosed with a serious mental health condition and still be considered legally sane. The law does not equate diagnosis with incapacity. That distinction is difficult. It can feel unsatisfying, but it is foundational to how federal courts operate. Outside the courtroom, northern Minnesota continued to process what had happened. The house was gone. The physical reminder reduced to debris and eventually cleared, but the memory lingered. Communities impacted by cases like this often experience layered grief. There is grief for the children, shock over the violence, confusion about how such a tragedy could unfold inside a family home, and in some cases, sorrow over the mental health struggles that may have been present long before the crime occurred. It is easy to focus only on the crime itself, the fire, the stabbing, the charges. But behind every federal case file are human lives, fractured, complicated, and forever changed. Jennifer Stately will now live out her sentence in federal prison. The Bureau of Prisons will determine her placement. Federal life sentences do not offer parole eligibility. Appeals may be filed, but overturning a jury verdict requires specific legal grounds, procedural error, evidentiary issues, or constitutional concerns. As of the verdict, the jury's decision stands. The house fire that first responders raced toward that night has long been extinguished, but its impact continues. This case leaves behind several difficult truths. First, the justice system operates within defined boundaries. Jurors are not asked to answer philosophical questions. They are asked to apply the law to the facts presented. Second, mental health remains a critical but complicated factor in criminal proceedings. Severe illness can exist alongside legal accountability. And third, tragedies involving children ripple far beyond a courtroom verdict. For viewers watching this story unfold, the natural question is often, could this have been prevented? That question is harder to answer. Mental health resources, community support systems, early intervention, all of these factors play roles in preventing crises. But criminal cases are judged after the fact. They examine what happened, not what might have been. The federal jury in this case fulfilled its duty. They weighed testimony. They followed instructions. They reached a unanimous conclusion. Guilty on all counts. As we close this three-part documentary, we return to where it began, that winter night in Minnesota, flames rising into the sky, neighbors watching in disbelief, sirens echoing in the cold air. At first, it looked like a devastating house fire. But it became something far more complex. A federal murder trial. An insanity defense rejected. A life sentence imposed. And a community left asking how something so catastrophic could unfold behind the walls of an ordinary home. If you followed this case with us from the beginning, share your thoughts respectfully below. Cases like this remind us how critical mental health awareness, early intervention, and community vigilance can be, but they also remind us of the weight of personal responsibility under the law. If you found this breakdown informative and fact-based, consider subscribing for more in-depth true crime documentaries grounded in verified court records and official sources. Because sometimes the fire is only the beginning, and understanding what comes after matters just as much.